This is a Renegade Special Investigative Report, the history of political correctness. Welcome everybody, I am Mike Sledge. This is a Saturday night special Renegade Investigative Report. This is called the history of political correctness, and I decided to look into this, and I've kind of been looking into it for quite some time, but I felt that there needed to be a show done on this topic because it's very interesting. The roots and the history of political correctness. And it really is a very interesting concept when you really look at it. And that's what I wanted to get on tonight, is the history, is exactly that history. So thanks for tuning in, and let's take a look at this. Let me start out with a quote here that I find very interesting. This is from the New York Times, and this appeared in the New York Times in May of 1917. And listen to this quote carefully. Quote, 6 or 8 weeks ago, the Jews would have needed... Excuse me, let me start that over again. This is the quote from the New York Times, 1917, May. Quote, 6 or 8 weeks ago, the Jews would have heeded the call to arms as a duty, but with heavy hearts, as they would have known they would be fighting to perpetuate Russian autocracy. But now all that has changed. Russian democracy has become victorious, and thanks are due to the Jew that the Russian Revolution succeeded. End of quote. And that was from a man, Jacob H. Schiff. He's known as the greatest Jew in America, from the Schiff dynasty, one of the financiers behind Lev Bronstein, whose commie name in the revolution was Trotsky. Let me read that again from the New York Times of May 1917. Quote, 6 or 8 weeks ago, the Jews would have heeded the call to arms as a duty, but with heavy hearts, as they would have known they would be fighting to perpetuate Russian autocracy. But now all that has changed. Russian democracy has become victorious, and thanks are due to the Jew that the Russian Revolution succeeded. End of quote. By Jacob H. Schiff from the Schiff dynasty in the New York Times from 1917. So they openly admitted it in 1917 here, you see, because they had already consolidated their power with the Federal Reserve, with the creation of the ADL, with the consolidation of the press, and Jacob Schiff was one of the financiers behind that. And by the way, nothing has changed today, because one of Al Gore's daughters has married into the Schiff family. So the power structure has been, remains in place behind the scenes, folks. Make no mistake about it. We are fighting the same enemy today that we were up against back in these times. The families have intermarried and they remain behind the scenes, controlling our sellout politicians who have sold out to the Jewish empire and the greater Zionist cause globally. And that quote really sums it up. And that quote puts to rest any doubt in anyone's mind that the Bolshevik Revolution was not a Jewish revolution. Now let's look at this in our history of political correctness. There was a poster put out by those who were anti-communist and against the Bolshevik Revolution. And in that poster that was put out in Russia, it shows Trotsky, Lev Bronstein, sitting on top of the Kremlin with a Star of David necklace around him. And he's painted red like a beast, looking down upon a mound of skulls from the dead bodies, the dead bodies that the communists and Bolsheviks had killed in the beginning of the revolution. And sitting on top of the mountain of skulls underneath the Kremlin, underneath the red Lev Bronstein, the red Trotsky, wearing the Star of David necklace in this poster, there are literally Mongolian soldiers holding the guns to tied up white Russians in a cell underneath the Kremlin. Isn't this interesting? Yes, even back then, this poster depicted the multicultural nightmare that was behind the Bolshevik Revolution. And you see, this was the beginning of political correctness, but this was also the beginning of using proxy armies of immigrants from other regions to come in to put down the European. In this case, to put down the white Russians. And they brought in the Mongolians to do that. And the Mongolian hordes and proxy armies were paid off with Jewish money from the Schiff dynasty that went into the hands of Lev Bronstein, a.k.a. Leon Trotsky, who brought that nightmare to the people of Russia, overthrowing the government to replace it with democracy. Now let's take a look at this. Trotsky was actually born of wealthy parents. He was the second in command to Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, another Jew, and he was one of the front people for the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Now, Jacob Schiff, who was the New York banker, was also an associate of the Rothschild dynasty. And he was known as one of the main conduits of international Jewry's funding of the Red Revolution. And I want you to listen to this. Back then in 1917, $20 million was given to Trotsky in gold bullion. Okay? From this international Jewry. $20 million in gold bullion. Well, that is close, folks, to $200 million in today's money. Trotsky deposited this money into the Warburg Bank. And he later, folks, married one of Warburg's daughters. The money in gold bullion was then transferred to Sweden and then into Russia. And this was the money that financed the Bolshevik Revolution that killed the white Russians over there during that nightmare, that multicultural nightmare, using the Mongolian hordes as a proxy to kill, to hold the gun to the head of the Russian people, to bring in the Jews and their democracy, aka communism. Interesting. Trotsky met with around 100 communist Jews from Brooklyn. And they all accompanied this gold. And they went on a ship. And the ship was actually chartered by Schiff and Warburg, the financiers from New York. Now listen to this. Canada actually intercepted the ship and arrested everyone on the ship. But very soon, they were all released along with the gold because of a call from the British intelligence Jew, Sir William Wiseman. A British intelligence officer named Sir William Wiseman had them released. He would later be rewarded with a position in the New York banking firm Kuhn, Loeb and Company, which is still around, folks. Make no mistake about it. This is what we are still up against. His best buddy, his best friend, was a man named Colonel Edward Mandell House, who was the brains behind Woodrow Wilson and the Wilson administration. And he was also most likely a Jew. He was the one who put pressure on Wilson to support the Federal Reserve Act of December 23rd, 1913, which was the beginning of the end for this country, folks. Make no mistake about it. He also, read the book Philip Drew Administrator, and it goes into detail of how they consolidated the Jewish power behind the Wilson administration. Now, what's interesting about this is, going back to this time, we begin to see the international Jewish agenda. We see the Jewish money coming out, the establishment of the Federal Reserve and the firms in New York who were the financiers behind the Bolshevik Revolution, and Lev Bronstein, Trotsky, and the Rothschilds. And this was the beginning of the effort to bring down Gentile nations And they wanted to start with Russia first to advance their cause of international Jewry, also known as communism. And around this same time, the word racist began to be employed in the tactics by these people. For the first time, really on a large scale, the word racist began to be thrown around by Trotsky. That's right, by Trotsky. He began to throw that around to ascribe to attack the Russian autocracy at the time, the Tsarist regime at the time, painting them as to be white Russian racist folks. This is the history you don't hear. And that actually was the precursor to the actual violence that took place. So he got his Jewish money from the Jewish machine there, the Schiff, the Warburgs. He married into the Warburg family. They got their money, and he began the propaganda machine of racism. Racism. They were a racist regime, he told the minds of the people and the workers throughout Russia. Yes. Racist. Now this is from the dictionary today, and it defines racist as this. Racist. 1932 as a noun, 1938 as an adjective. From race. Racism is first attested 1936 from Racism, 1935. Originally in the context of Nazi theory. See how they put in the propaganda. But they replaced earlier words, racialism, 1907, and racialist, 1917. Racialist, 1917. Listen carefully. But often used at first in a British or South African context. That's what they have in there. But they mentioned that it was used first, racialist, in 1917. Now make note of this. Make note how the dictionary puts French descriptions and Nazi theory in there, which is absolutely history revisionism, folks. And they begin to revise history and change the definitions. The truth is, it was a German Jew who was given credit for the word. A German Jew. Not Nazis, but a German Jew. And this Jew actually went into exile in France after the Nazis came to power because Hitler knew their game. And he got the boot and he left. And it was his writings, and his name was Magnus Hirschfeld. He actually came up with this theory. Now, according to another dictionary in '89, the Oxford English Dictionary, the earliest known form of the word racism in English occurred in a 1936 book by, it says, American, quote, fascist Lawrence Dennis, The Coming American Fascism. Now, they use this term in English in the Oxford English Dictionary, and it says that it's the title of a book originally written in Germany in 1933, 1934, and in 34. But when it's translated into English, and when it was first published in 1938, it was the book Racism by Magnus Hirschfeld, a Jew who actually came up with the term here, the modern term, how it's used today. The book was translated by Eden and Cedar Paul. Hirschfeld died in 1935 before the publication of the book the following year. He had already used the word in his text and in the title of his book. So it seems only fair to recognize him as the originator of the word racism. The Oxford English Dictionary says the first known usage was to Hirschfeld himself. Magnus Hirschfeld. And let's see what he had to do. Let's look at his history. Magnus Hirschfeld, he lived from 1868 to 1935. He was a German Jewish scientist. He worked in the field of what he termed sexology. He said this was the study of sex. These Jews are always obsessed with sex, aren't they? Hirschfeld was one of the first to begin studying all the different aspects of sexuality, and he believed in what he called sexual liberation. All of his major areas of study, folks, were in the field of homosexuality. Okay? His conclusion was that traditional sexual morality was immoral, repressive, and against freedom for all people. We can see how this is beginning here, right? We can see where this pablum goes back to. Hirschfeld was also the founder of the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin and helped organize sexology on the international scene, folks. In 1922, he was physically attacked and almost killed by the anti-Semites in Munich. Wonder why? They wanted to get this garbage out of their country. And in 1933, the Hitler regime shut down the Institute of Sexual Science, and Hirschfeld, the Jew, was forced to flee to France. Thank God he was forced to flee to France. So we see now where the term racism came from. And the first political movement to use racialism was the Bolsheviks and the Communist Revolution of 1917, as I referred to in the poster put out by the anti-communists. And they were the beginning of the use of proxy armies. It was not long after the Bolshevik Revolution that you were not allowed to say certain words. And one of the words you were not allowed to say, it was considered hate speech. That's right, hate speech was the word Jew. If you even uttered the word Jew, you would be shipped to Siberia. And then Hirschfeld was the next one to put it out, Magnus Hirschfeld. He also began to put out the propaganda of how homosexuality was more natural and liberating, and traditional sex was immoral and wrong and racist. This is where it came from. Interesting, huh? Hirschfeld